Welcome to Under the Microscope. Today I'm here with Dr. Bridget Behe, Professor of Horticultural Marketing at Michigan State University. Dr. Behe has researched and written over 1,000 publications on horticultural products. In 2024, she was awarded the Benjamin Morrison Lecture, which recognizes scientists who have made outstanding contributions in the areas of ornamental horticulture and other environmental sciences. Welcome, Dr. Behe, to Under the Microscope.
Thanks, Todd. I appreciate that introduction, and it's a real honor and a privilege to have been awarded the Morrison Lectureship this year.
Well, thank you. So the first question I have for you, I want to kind of zoom out. What is horticultural marketing?
Well, horticulture marketing is looking at horticultural products, mostly ornamentals, things like petunias and begonias, and connecting buyers and sellers. So the goal of my research really is to better understand the consumer so that I can help the grower and the retailer, and that should result in a better shopping process for the consumer.
And that kind of brings me to my next question. How does this research benefit both the consumer and the seller?
Well, a lot of sellers, a lot of growers and retailers don't have the time or the money or the expertise to do their own consumer research. And so what I and my team have done is to study consumer behavior within the context of buying those ornamental plants. Now, if we can improve the shopping process for the seller, I think it's going to result in a happier experience, a better experience for those end users, for those buyers. So it really is a win-win result.
And then from your research, like what aspects, because we're talking plants here, what aspects of a plant display, even like the plant itself, do consumers mainly focus on?
In a retail setting, most of the decision process is really based on what that plant is. But there are a lot of characteristics about the plant and a lot of different ways that retailers can merchandise those plants. And so we study kind of individually and on the whole things like signage and what kind of plant it is and other attributes about the plant, characteristics that might not be readily seen about the plant.
And then kind of on the other end, what are some of the lesser focused cues, as you call it in your research? What are consumers not paying much attention to according to your research or your findings?
Well, it's really interesting, Todd, that consumers are so diverse, and some people will pay a lot of attention to price, where other people will hardly pay any attention to that at all. And so one of the things we've done looking at signage is to understand who looks at what different types of information, because that will help us better engineer the signs so that people get the information they want very quickly. We also want to understand how the different characteristics of the plant, like whether it's an annual or a perennial, what color the flower is, maybe what flavor the edible leaves are. We want to understand those things and the role they play in the purchase process.
Okay, I'm going to admit it. I look at price. That's usually the first thing I look at. So what are the other, like what are the things or in your research, why would people look at other things other than price? I mean, that's got to be, of course, one of the biggest factors. When is it not a big factor?
It's not a big factor if somebody is really in love with what kind of plant that is. They absolutely have to have that plant. So for some people, having a plant that reminded them of their parents or their grandparents is really important. I won't say price is no object, but they're not really price sensitive about buying plants that they're really truly in love with. For other people, it's how it was grown, whether that plant was grown organically or sustainably or conventionally. They may be concerned about the environment, and so they're interested in buying a plant that has had fewer inputs or safer inputs during the production process. Some consumers are also interested in where it was grown. They want to buy something from their local nursery that was grown locally. Now we know for the plant to be established, being in that local environment is better. And a lot of companies, I shouldn't say a lot, some companies ship plants in from great distances. Doesn't mean the plant's going to die, but it's not been acclimatized or adapted to the local environment. So things like where the plant was grown, how the plant was grown, play a role in that purchase process.
Okay, let's talk about your unique research technology. These wild glasses that you're putting on some people to kind of track kind of their movements and their eyes. Tell me a little bit about it.
We discovered, and we didn't invent these. I was at a trade show 20 some years ago, and one of the companies, Master Tag, had the eye tracking software and glasses in their booth. And so I was introduced to this and I thought, wow, this is really going to be a powerful tool for consumer behavior because the eyes don't lie. And basically what these glasses do is they track about the size of a dime from about an arm's length away, precisely what people are looking at. Now, we have to go through human subjects approval. Anytime you do research at a university, you have to get the ethics committee approval. And we do that, and we tell our subjects who participate in the studies, we're going to put these eye tracking glasses on. They really have very, very low risk. We haven't had, thankfully, anyone injured wearing them. But the cool thing about the technology is you give people a task. You say, buy a birthday gift for a friend, and they're in a garden center. And so you can see what information on signs, what plants they look at, things that they don't look at. It's really fascinating. And then my team and I take all this data and distill it down a bit and try to understand what different consumers are doing during these different purchase tasks.
And I think one of the things that you noticed was that touching could equate to purchasing. Was that one of the big findings?
In one of the studies that we did, we took people into real garden centers. Some studies we do in the lab and some studies we do in the field. And we noticed this big range of consumers. Some people really wanted to touch and smell the plant and the flower. And as young children, we're kind of conditioned to bend into and smell that flower. So those sensory experiences are really important to some people. But we had folks on the other end of the scale who really didn't need to touch or smell or physically interact with the plants. And so having that wide range tells us there are probably some people who are better suited to buying plant material online, whereas the people who are kind of high touch, they want to touch and smell everything, they might not have as an enjoyable experience buying a plant online. They're a better candidate for buying plants in the store.
And I want to get into the signage, but I have to ask you about this one finding, which I thought was pretty wild, that you found that people were actually looking at other people's carts and what's in the carts before they bought the product.
This was really interesting, Todd. We didn't expect to see this at all. And we think what's happening here is that something caught their attention, whether it was a really pretty flower or a new plant or some unique foliage. And so it diverted their attention into somebody else's cart. And we think that retailers could use this kind of a finding and put someone, a store employee in plain clothes with a new plant and have them walk around the store to really showcase that plant, to capitalize on this looking at someone else's cart. And maybe that would help to drive some sales.
Yeah, that'd actually be some pretty savvy marketing right there.
I think so.
Yeah. I'm going to check myself next time I go to see if I'm looking at other people's carts. I probably do as well, but I thought that was a wild finding.
It is. And the way we look at things is not at random. And we have a purpose. When we look at things, when we drive a car is very different from when we're going to buy a plant. And so we don't even think about looking at someone else's cart. It's just something that some of us do.
Okay, let's talk about signage then, because I know you did a lot of research on that. How important is good signage, including the placement and location? Like, how should a consumer decide on those factors?
signage is incredibly important because you can't always see something about the plant when you look at it. For example, you can't tell where it was grown, nor can you tell how it was grown. And in today's society, we're increasingly more interested in where things are grown and how they're grown. It's also really hard to tell whether something is a pollinator attractor. Unless you have that expertise, you may not know that bees and hummingbirds and other pollinators are attracted to a particular kind of plant. And concern about pollinator habitat and food is really important to some consumers today. So retailers need to think strategically about what they put on the sign and where they put that on the sign. As I mentioned earlier, we need to put those value-added attributes up closer to the top because we tend to read a sign very much like we read a book, from left to right and from top to bottom. So putting the attributes of the plant, for example, it was grown sustainably and maybe this is a pollinator attractor, we want to put that information ahead of price so that we can get a higher margin.
And then how much information do people read? And you kind of touched on this. Does it matter if it's a low-priced item versus a high-priced item?
It really does. And the higher the price, the more someone will focus on those value-added benefits. On a lower price, those things really don't even matter. And so we've got to be thinking about, is this a plant that is really common? If that's the case, then it's probably going to be purchased based on what the price is. But if it's new or novel or has a lot of these value-added benefits, that's where the retailer could get a little bit of a higher margin. And so strategically placing that information will help to put that in front of the consumer's eye before they get to the pricing information. And we know that more information that's on there, it's this inverted U shape. It's almost like a mountain that people will read a decreasing amount of information the more we pack into that sign. So there's a Goldilocks effect, kind of the sweet spot of the just right amount of information.
And then what about the area placement of the sign, whether it's above the product, to the left, to the right, below? Or did you find that there's a better than not placement area?
Well, we read displays very much like we read signs in a book, from left to right and from top to bottom. So again, when we've got some plants that are really a good bargain price, a good value, putting that sign up high and to the left will capture the consumer's attention faster than putting it lower and to the right. And interestingly enough, we can also alter how they read that display by merchandising things in columns. That kind of disrupts that flow, whereas merchandising things in stripes facilitates or helps the consumer read that display faster.
And then also, what about like volume? Like, is it better to have a lot of plants in display or just a few?
You know, it was interesting, Todd, when we increased the number of plants in a display, we got a very rapid, it wasn't a linear, a straight line, it was a very rapid decrease in the number of plants that people actually looked at. The paradox of choice is not something that we discovered. It's been around for about 20 years. But we know that the more choices you have, the harder it is to make a choice. And so these kind of mass displays are better suited for plants that have been in the market for a long time, cultivars that have been out there for 5, 10 or more years. But when we have new or unique or really cool new kinds of plants that we don't have very many of, you definitely don't want to put those in a mass display because people are going to overlook a lot of those choices. So we get that feeling of abundance when we see a big display of plants, but we don't actually look at each and every one of them to make that decision. We want people to spend more time on individual plants, looking at individual plants, when that's a higher profit margin for the retailer.
Okay, and you had, I mean, a lot of really interesting findings that we talked about today. What surprised you most? What was the one finding that you were surprised by?
I was really surprised at how similar visual behavior is, that even though people are looking at different bits of information, the purchase decision happens really quickly, just a few seconds. People just don't have the bandwidth, the brain power, if you will, to spend a lot of time thinking about these decisions. They're on autopilot. They have 57 other things that they need to do before the end of the day. And so not spending a lot of time in the decision process was a real big aha. And then the other thing was how similar that process really was across consumers. It happened very quickly, and people again move from left to right and top to bottom. Reading has imprinted us with a really cool systematic way of going through bits of information and finding what we need. So I thought it might be a little more diverse in how people gathered that information to make a decision, but it really wasn't. And that was kind of a big surprise.
Outside of the ornamental horticulture field, do you see this research applying and being beneficial to other industries, other markets as well?
Oh, absolutely. Plants usually are not in boxes or bottles. They can be, but they're usually not sold like that. And so a lot of the impetus for our research was trying to understand if these very slightly different plants were looked at in a different way from boxes and bottles. And it turns out they're really not that different. But my colleagues and I have gone to several international conferences and presented our findings. And most of these people don't work with plant material at all. And so we do see application to the general retail environment of a lot of the research that we've done. And we've also seen it cited in other publications by folks who aren't working with plants at all. And so we were really able to leverage a lot of the grant dollars that we got, not just to help the horticulture industry, but to help the business field at large.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, it's a really, really interesting research to dive into. Thanks for sharing it with us.
You're welcome, Todd. It's been a great ride, a lot of fun. And again, I appreciate being awarded the lectureship this year.